Hello there. My name is Dr. Salim Javed and I'm an associate professor at the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication at Lingas Leta Devi Institute of Management and Sciences, affiliated with Guru Gobind Singh Indraprastha University. We have been talking about cinema, and we have been trying to explain it to you so that you understand cinema better, and we have been talking about the evolution of narrative. We have talked about how cinema started, how initially it came into being, how Lumiere brothers and George Méliès contributed in the development of cinema, and today we are going to talk about Edwin S. Potter. Now, after George Méliès, we have been explaining about George Méliès, and as you know that George Méliès elevated French cinema to global recognition, because we have talked about George Méliès a lot, and we have said that how when Lumiere brothers did not sell him the camera, how he managed the camera, how he discovered through an accident obviously something called editing, and how it changed the very nature of making film in the beginning itself. So, George Méliès came from France. So, it was George Méliès's contribution, which if you remember, I talked about A Trip to the Moon, and there is another very interesting film, A Trip to the Sun. Also, most of people have only seen A Trip to the Moon, but they must also see a film called A Trip to the Sun, which was made in 1907. So, George Méliès actually elevated French cinema to global recognition, and though his style was very elegant, but as I explained, if you remember, that it was also a very static storytelling technique. Now, apart from Lumiere brothers cinematograph, then George Méliès, A Trip to the Moon, One Band Army, a lot of films, and now we are talking about Edwin S. Potter. Now, Edwin S. Potter is basically an American filmmaker, and his full name is Edwin Stanton Potter, and he is popularly known as Edwin S. Potter. So, he is like if you see the chronology, it is basically Lumiere brothers. Before Lumiere brothers, it was William Kennedy Laurie Dixon. Before him, it was Thomas Alva Edison, and then before him, it was Edward Muybridge. So, from Edward Muybridge to Thomas Alva Edison to William Kennedy Laurie Dixon to the patent thing that I have talked about, and then Lumiere brothers, from Lumiere brothers to George Méliès, and the next important person in the row is Edwin S. Potter. Now, why Edwin S. Potter is important, why he is put in the same line as George Méliès or Lumiere brothers, and then you have the third name is Edwin S. Potter. What sort of films, what sort of innovation, what sort of new technique he has brought to the table, that he has become so important person in the history of filmmaking. If I say it like this, that if George Méliès discovered editing, Edwin S. Potter gave it a new dimension, a dimension which not only is different from George Méliès, because George Méliès track was like fantasy. So, Edwin S. Potter did something which is like not very far from fantasy, and it is like not very distant from reality. So, it is somewhere in between, and it will be interesting when I will be talking about different films made by Edwin S. Potter. Then you will realize that what do I mean, that he is far from fantasy, but not at a very great distance from reality. That is not reality. Reality is actualities. Please understand, actualities is the track which was opened by Dizige Vertov, documentary style, Lumiere brothers, actualities, Lumiere brothers, and the entire documentary movement. So, I am not talking about actuality, okay, which is like leading towards a documentary. I am not talking about only fantasy, which is like Méliès track. Edwin S. Potter is somewhere in between, and that is where most of the cinema you and I see today is situated. So Edwin S. Potter is important in this particular sense, that he carries the elegance of George Méliès. He has the sensibility of actualities, and he is bringing these two. I mean, by this time I am talking about 1900. By this time, these are two different, tracks, and Edwin S. Potter is somewhere in between, and he is beautifully, handling these two tracks. And the films, the two films that I will be talking about of Edwin S. Potter, The Life of a Fireman and The Great Tin Robbery, that I will be talking about and explaining during the course of the lecture also, you will understand that why it is not actuality and why it is not fantasy. So, the exploration of cinematic narrative possibilities, that Lumière's talk about, that Méliès talks about, not Lumière. Lumière is about actualities. That Méliès talks about, the culmination of that, or rather, not exactly the culmination, the logical grounding of narrative possibilities, which Méliès explored, finds a sort of a feat when you watch films made by Edwin S. Potter. Now, who is Edwin S. Potter? Edwin S. Potter basically started his career as a Vitascope projectionist. Now, please understand, when I talk about Vitascope projectionist, what does it mean? It is Vitascope is also one of the cameras technically, okay, which was developed along with the cinematograph. Lumiere brothers made cinematograph, Sklandelavsky brothers created Bioscope. In England, this camera, Robert William Paul created a camera. So a lot of, we know only, like majority of the students of film studies know only about cinematograph. Very few, exclusive group of a student know about Bioscope, because Bioscope was a very popular term, and made by Sklandelavsky brothers. But very few people know about different. There were more cameras, and Vitascope was one of them. So Edwin S. Potter was the Vitascope projectionist, and interestingly, he was with the Edison Corporation, and he joined Edison Corporation in 1896. Now, this is something again very interesting. If you remember, when I talked about kinetograph, the first motion picture camera, as you know it, first motion picture camera, kinetograph, was made by who? If you have been following my lecture, you must know that it was made by William Kennedy Laurie Dixon. And who was William Kennedy Laurie Dixon? William Kennedy Laurie Dixon was the lab assistant of Thomas Alva Edison. Now, Edwin S. Potter is also Vitascope projectionist and technician for the Edison Corporation, and he joined it in 1896. So, like today, after this 1960 news research paper, a lot of people started sulking about Thomas Alva Edison, that he was not the inventor of theatrograph. Yes, that's a fact that he was not. It was William Kennedy Laurie Dixon, and Thomas Alva Edison, obviously a big name, and he is not only limited to motion picture camera, he is into a lot of other inventions also. But you really understand this as an employer, from an employer point of view. Thomas Alva Edison had a knack for picking up very brilliant people in the beginning of cinema, be that William Kennedy Laurie Dixon, or be that Edwin S. Potter, both of them working for Edison, technically, directly and indirectly for Edison. So by 1900, so he joined in 1896. He kept on working as a Vitascope projectionist, and started working as a technician. And by 1900, he became, because he was there, he was among film reels, he was dealing with people, he knew who is who of the business. So it was because he was in Edison Corporation. So he started directing, he became a cameraman, and ultimately production head at the newly established Edison Skylight Studio on East 21st Street, New York City. Now, very interestingly, when you are among the people who are making film, you are the pioneer, you are with the team who is a pioneer, and you are obviously with Edison. So, and you are working for him in his company called Edison Corporation. So, what ultimately you will do? Obviously, you will make films. So did Edwin S. Potter. So, Edwin S. Potter, his inaugural film comprised short skits and actualities. Now, again, this is very interesting. As I said, that when you talk about actualities and when you talk about skits, you know, now on the one hand, like when I say actualities, think of Lumiere Brothers. When I say magic, when I say fantasy, think about George Méliès. Now, in his very first film, which is called Kansas City Salon Smashers, which he made in 1901, what he is doing? He is basically bringing these two ideas together. So, on the one hand, his inaugural film is catching hold of skits, the George Méliès track, and on the other hand, it is catching hold of actualities, Lumiere Brothers track. So, from the very first film that I just said, that he is not towards fantasy, he is not very close to reality, he is somewhere in between. And as I am talking about his first film, Kansas City Salon Smashers, which he made in 1901, he is actually combining, he is actually comprising skit and actuality. His next film was New York City in Blizzard, which he made in 1901, and as I said, that it is only perpetuated the Edison and Lumiere's legacy. So, think of this, that he is like very close to Lumiere, actualities, and a bit of a pinch of salt, sort of a skit thing, because cinema is still in its initial stages. It's in a nascent stage right now. It is still taking a shape. So, two films that I have talked about, which Edwin S. Potter made initially. One was Kansas City Salon Smasher, which he made in 1901, and the next film was the New York City in Blizzard, which he made in 1901. But if you ask people, okay, are these the film that you remember Edwin S. Potter for? Chances are that people will say no. So, like, because I teach, so I really have to tell student also, but the two films that people talk about when it comes to Edwin S. Potter is The Life of American Fireman and The Great Train Robbery, and both were like in 1903, So, The Life of an American Fireman was started, the production started and everything in 1902, and it was released in 1903. Now, subsequently to 1900, Potter discovered the film of Méliès. Now, this is something really, really interesting. So, obviously, he made two films, in 1901 and 1902. But as I said, that it was an amalgamation of skit and actualities. Skit is not exactly fantasy, it's not the dream world. Its skit is like situational, that this is like you have to prepare, this is the situation and you have to prepare a skit for it. So, it is not fantasy, but it's grounded in reality, but obviously a hyper reality in a technical sense. So, Potter discovered Méliès, before he started making his own film. So George Méliès was in France, Edwin S. Potter is in America, and he started George Méliès started making film as early as 1896, and I am talking about 1900. That Potter discovered the films of Méliès by 1900. So, technically George Méliès has, his style, you know, became popular, as soon as he started making film, and obviously by 1902 when it comes a Trip to the Moon, obviously it was a commercial success. Now, remember the term commercial success, because this is the word which is also associated with Edwin S. Potter, and I'll tell you how George Méliès is a pioneer. I have been talking about George Méliès, how he's a pioneer, and when I was explaining it, so I remember talking about how the last picture made by George Méliès and what he said there, what Charlie Chaplin said about him, and how what D.W. Griffith said about him. But this video is not about George Méliès. I love talking about George Méliès. So Edwin S. Potter also is Edwin S. Potter is also very important when it comes to commerce, when it comes to business of filmmaking, and I'll tell you why he is as important as George Méliès. Now, when Edwin S. Potter started watching, George Méliès' film, he discovered something which was not available in the films of other director. You know, I'll be talking about the influence on Edwin S. Potter. George Méliès is an obvious, influence. There is he was he was really impressed by the works of British pioneers like G. A. Smith and James Williamson. Now, who are these people called G. A. Smith and James Williamson? Now, these two gentlemen are the British pioneers, obviously in filmmaking, and they the work of G. A. Smith and James William is considered as the work under Bristol Studios, Bryston Studio. Sorry, Bryston Studio. Now, what is Bryston Studio? Obviously, it's an British studio, and Edwin S. Potter. Now, like imagine if I am Edwin S. Potter, whom I am working with? I am working with Thomas Alva Edison. Okay, so I have all the resources, and that is what will help shape his film also. So I am working with Thomas Alva Edison. I am Edwin S. Potter. What I am looking at? I am looking at George Méliès, his work for last 4 years. What I am looking at? I am looking at G. A. Smith and James Williamson. So George Méliès has got some quality, specification, style. G. A. Smith and James Williamson has got a peculiar style, British pioneers. Now, what do you get out of these three dimension? This Thomas Alva Edison, George Méliès, and then G. A. Smith and James Williamson. Now, imagine a circle around me. So, from the back circle, which is Thomas Alva Edison, I am getting resources as a filmmaker. From George Méliès, editing, magic, storytelling, which is different than actualities. Now, from G. A. Smith and James Williamson, what I am getting? Now, this is very interesting, and you will see how this circle helps him make his own, helps him craft his own identity. Now, close-ups, right now it is my mid shot. So, close-up is something which which is basically he has learned from G. A. Smith and James Williamson and their school called Bryston Studio, their studio called Bryston Studio. Now, what does it do? Three different dimensions, me at the center as Edwin S. Potter, what it does. Now, uh, it appears probable that in multiple films, like Attack on a Chinese Mission Station, which was made in 1900, another film called Fire, which was made in 1901, Williamson employed a rudimentary technique of parallel editing by transitioning from an exterior shot of a building to an interior shot and returning to the exterior. Now, this is something which I talked about close up, then I said from exterior shot of a building to an interior shot and returning to an exterior shot. Now, this is something, and these are the two films, which was, one was Attack on the Chinese Mission Station and the other film was Fire, which was 1901, and Williamson employed a rudimentary technique of parallel editing. Now, think of what George Méliès was doing, magic, appearing, disappearing, one man at 10 different places, one man playing the entire band, Now, somewhere George Méliès is doing it is in France, and Williamson is doing it in Britain. What he is doing? Parallel editing. Now, a lot of people, when they talk about, especially the Great Train Robbery, and for that matter, the life of a fireman also, they talk about how interior exterior was introduced. No, even Edwin S. Potter took inspiration from Williamson's film called Attack on Chinese Mission Station and Fire, which was made in 1900 and 1901, and that is what he was learning by watching. Resources he had because he has got a certain sort of a backing and he has been watching. Last week I conducted a filmmaking workshop in my college, and I tried to explain a lot of things. But when my students saw that workshop, it was non-stop for 5 days, and when I took a feedback from them about how was the workshop, then they said, sir, we knew that it is a very interesting process, but we witnessed it not only for a day or two, 5 consecutive days in a highly professional setup, which I did at my college, and they were like, they could understand, when you see, when you feel, when you are in that milieu, when you personally go through it, when you personally witness it, and when you are given some sort of a work, when you are asked ki jao chini leke aao, or find the right flask to put in the frame, because like the shot was, it was a very interesting shot, that the camera was there, the student was sitting here, and there was a bottle placed in front of him, obviously on his desk. Now, because of the camera angle, the bottle was entirely covering from shoulder to his head. Now, suddenly I asked, it's a wrong bottle, give me a shorter bottle. Then somebody brought that 250 ml Bisleri. I said, no, we are not making a Bisleri ad. So don't give me this. Somebody said, ki sir, iska upar ka wrapper hata dete hain. I said, even then people will be able to recognize that it's a Bisleri bottle. Give me something suitable. Then somebody had a, I think 400 ml decent bottle. The color was also decent. When we put it, it was up till here and the face was absolutely visible. So then they realized that the importance of prop when it was not covering the face of an actor. Angle was such. I mean, we did not have much space to move around. So that was that was a very good angle, and it was one of the master shots where we were doing something with the bottle also, which eventually became part of the flashback also. But so it has to be there in the master. It has to be there in the first frame. It has to be there in the master shot. So when we put it, then we realize even the size of, students realize that even the color of the prop, the size of the prop, the material of the prop, because the way it reflects light also matters a lot. Now, why am I telling you this thing? When it comes to any teacher in the world who is teaching you film studies, be that in India or in Malaysia or Dubai or US or Uganda or Suganda, that's irrelevant. So, any teacher who is telling you, who is teaching you about film studies, one of the things that he talks about is watch as much as you can. Watch good films, watch films made by different directors, watch films from different countries, watch different style of films, watch anime, watch short films, watch long films, watch animation, cartoon, a lot of other things also, but watch. So, that is what is the peculiar quality of Edwin S. Potter, that before he makes his own style, which I will be talking about, which before he makes his own style, before a style that he is known for in the world, he has a peculiar habit, and this is what this is what students should learn from Edwin S. Potter, that he exposed himself to different style of filmmaking available in that time, available at that point of time. That is what is need to be learned. I was talking to my student, so I said, okay, तुम्हारी अंग्रेजी खराब हो सकती है, okay, fine, not a problem, but at least you have command over one language. Okay, when I came to Delhi, I had a command over Hindi. So now when I get into a business which is creative enough, and which is interestingly talking about films, which is talking about comic book, which is talking about literature, so at least I can start with one language. I need to be thorough with the literature of that one particular language. If I come from a background where Hindi is spoken, so at least I should be aware of the literature which is available in Hindi. There is no parallel to that. So, Edwin S. Potter teaches us that before you make your style, explore all the possibilities which are available in market, which he actually did, from Thomas Alva Edison to George Méliès to directors like Williamson and his style. Thank you very much.